Welcome to Perspectives on Healthy Living. I'm Gabrielle Antolovich, your host, and we are talking with Lisa Frederiksen, who is the author of many a book, and her latest one is Loved One in Treatment for Alcoholism, right?
Or drug addiction.
Or drug addiction. And now what? Because, you know, a lot of people actually feel that the problem's over once the addicted person gets into treatment, right?
Right.
But that's not true, is it?
No.
So
no.
what actually happens?
Well, a lot of times what happens is the family members, there could be a lot of anger getting into it depending on the relationship or how long it's taken. But then there's this sense that now they're...
When you say anger, what do you mean? Angry about what?
Anger at the addict alcoholic believing that they could have done something to stop this. And
you could have stopped sooner.
Right?
Why
if you would have
you...
just done, and there's a lot of times been many deals. Okay, we'll do it this way, and you don't do that, and if you do this, then that'll happen, and broken promises, and mainly because no one in the family system understands addiction, and so that perpetuates the problem. And so anyway, by the time the loved one finally gets into treatment, then you have the family member either anticipating, oh, phew, finally it's over, and then it doesn't feel better. Or they could have a lot of anger and just feel like, go get yourself fixed, and when you're done, come home.
Yeah, so, come home and apologize.
All will be well. Right. And there's a long road ahead.
Is part of it because in society in general, we don't accept addiction as a chronic, ongoing illness, that people think that you could have stopped if you wanted to?
Correct. I think that's a huge part of the problem. There's roughly 23 million people who suffer from addiction, and
in this country,
and only about 10% seek help. And then compared to 23 million diabetics, of which 75, sometimes estimates are as high as 85% seek help. And it's this different perception of the two diseases. And while, yes, they're both diseases, what makes it so difficult is we didn't understand until just this last 10, 15 years that addiction is a brain disease. And because it's a brain disease, that's what affects how the people behave who have this disease. The other problem, too, is that along the way, all addict alcoholics go through a period of substance abuse, which is not full-blown addiction. And it's during the abuse stage that's when all the deal-making, and it's not that bad, and because nobody wants to call him an alcoholic addict.
I'm not as bad as the neighbor,
right,
or the uncle.
Yeah, and then that's what starts to set up secondhand drinking or drugging impacts to the family members or friends who are close to them.
What do you mean by secondhand drinking? Is
it's
that like secondhand smoking?
Yes, right. It's to try to get that same sense of, we all appreciate when somebody's smoking that it has an impact on my health or the people in their sphere, but we don't understand that when somebody's drinking or abusing substances, that has an impact on those in their sphere too. So that's what the term's hoping to try to elicit, that kind of connection.
With secondhand smoke, it's obvious that it affects other people because there's smoke.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But with addiction, there's so much emotional stuff, and isn't there an emotional expression like you're blowing smoke?
Yes.
So there's this emotional smoke that affects other people, and that's what secondhand drinking is.
It's, the fights with the loved one about this is the last time, or you wouldn't believe what you did last night, it was so horrible, or they come home and you're trying to judge how much they've had to drink or if they're high, and so you're watching, and then maybe they go to the kitchen and you follow along to see if you can hear, try to catch them, or you sit down at the dinner table and maybe dad's having a few more drinks and mom's starting to get anxious, and then the children are trying to judge who's going to blow first, and then they just kind of like try to sneak off. And so all of that is having an impact. And for children, for example, they go to their room then, and then they start to hear the escalation of the fight upstairs, and maybe they can't really concentrate on their homework, or maybe they aren't getting sleep, and then the next morning they come upstairs or come out of their rooms, and dad's being really nice, trying to make it up to mom, and mom's not taking it. She's really mad because dad doesn't understand what he did, and that is what we mean by secondhand drinking. It's the impact of the change in the brain, the change in the person's behaviors, not only that individual, but the way the other people react to that. And that dynamic creates an immense ripple effect.
And we don't talk about that very much.
No.
I mean, even in the news, you know, you see these stories about heroin addicts and alcoholics falling down and all of that, but you don't see the impact on families. Why is that?
I think, well, because I think it's the stigma around addiction, period. So we can barely talk about the addict alcoholic, let alone that the family, that there's an impact on them. And then because society still believes that once you stop, all is well, then they think that the family should just be well, and not realizing, depending on how many years that's been going on, that dynamic, you know, you can only imagine the intimacy or the co-parenting. If it's a child who has the problem, one parent believing we got to do something, and the other parent saying, well, all kids go through this, it'll pass, and that dynamic. And then you have the other children in the family, and they kind of get lost in the shuffle. So. And then that's just in the family. Then those people go off to school, or they go off to the workplace, and they're looking and they go, oh gosh, what does she mean by that look? Or listen to her tone of voice, and they interpret that as meaning you're mad at them, because that's how they've stayed safe at home. They've had to hear the sound of the voice, or they've had to listen for the pop of the can to know, here it goes again, this is going to be one of those nights. Or, oh, he's on his way to drunk because of the way the key sounds in the door. So they take that same heightened sense of awareness of their surroundings into their, and so you go out into society, into the workplace and school.
So if you have a rageaholic, alcoholic parent, then if somebody yells at work, it impacts you a hell of a lot more.
Because you're reacting to what you have been conditioned to.
Oh, that's
And you
horrible.
interpret it as something for you to react to, as opposed to whether it's really directed at you or not.
And you may not even know if it was a little bit of anger or a lot of anger. It's just you're hypervigilantly receiving it.
Right. And that's another part of it, is so much of what happens to the family members is surrounding the emotional reactions to the person. And this is the hard part, is we always look at addiction, but it's this long period of substance abuse. For example, all alcoholics will go through alcohol abuse, but not all alcohol abusers will become alcoholics. Yet the behaviors are the same. Because the alcohol impacts the brain, which then impacts the way a person thinks and behaves, and it doesn't have to be full-blown addiction. In fact, I think we have a slide that shows, I think it's a 38-year-old brain of an individual who had 17 years of heavy weekend use. And a lot of times we always say, oh, well, they're not an alcoholic.
Slide, actually.
Yeah, they're not an alcoholic because they go to work.
Right. And so that brain is very impacted. And that's just weekend use.
Just weekend use.
Yeah.
Correct.
So can we go back to the slide before? And there's a normal brain. So a normal brain does not have holes in it.
No. And this is not like missing brain matter, but what the holes show, bottom right, would be the same image comparing the two top-down views, is areas of low blood flow and areas of low brain activity. And so giving you the visual that something has to be happening in the brain, and helping us better appreciate that these chemical and structural changes that occur with substance abuse change how a person thinks, behaves, and acts.
That seems to be the latest innovation in the last maybe 20 years. You know, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the federal government research wing on addiction, has done a lot on understanding how the brain works and how it doesn't work under the influence. And has that been useful information?
Absolutely. For me, understanding addiction as a brain disease and why was huge, because it let me let go of anger and resentments. And
so you don't blame them.
You don't blame them because you understand how addiction works. And basically everything we think, feel, say, and do is governed by how our brain cells talk to one another and talk to other neurons in the body. And that requires what they call a neural network. And so addiction or drugs of abuse, alcohol or illegal or prescription drugs, attack the neural networks in the limbic system, in the pleasure reward center. And if a person repeatedly abuses, it causes the brain to change how it wires and how those connections work. And to just back up a minute, when you drink alcohol, it's not digested the same way as food. It passes straight through to the small intestine and into the bloodstream, and it dilutes in water and goes to body tissue with a lot of water, which the brain is one. So it sits there, and you can just picture this depressant substance sitting.
So this is a big vat of alcohol.
And it takes about 1 hour because we only process through the liver. So it takes the liver about 1 hour to process one standard drink. So if somebody's drinking 8, 9, 10 drinks a night, it's taking 8, 9, 10 hours for their liver to process that amount of alcohol.
If the liver is healthy.
If the liver is healthy.
Right.
So then it sits in the brain, and that's why their behaviors change. So not understanding that, that's why people say they get into fights, they have ridiculous arguments, they drive while impaired because they're not thinking clearly. It's not that they thought, well, if I have 5 drinks, I should be able to go drive. It starts to compromise their judgment, the neural networks responsible for judgment. Yeah.
Right. Whoa. So, you know, if somebody has cancer, people have compassion.
Right.
When somebody has addiction, people get mad and blame you for having the illness. So that's a tough one.
And the part of the...
Including the family.
Oh, yes, because what we don't understand is substance abuse is one thing, causing the brain changes like we showed on that slide. But then why some people cross the line to addiction and others don't are what they call risk factors. And, well, let me just touch bases on what makes addiction versus just substance abuse. And one of them is cravings, because when the brain starts to get bombarded, those dopamine neural pathways, what the brain does is in beauty is it dials down the dopamine, which causes it to lose receptors. And so then you've hijacked the connections for pleasure.
Right.
So the person drinks more, trying to get that feel-good feeling, and that's what starts to set up tolerance, which is another symptom. Cravings, an addiction craving is 5 times stronger than the instinctual, hardwired desire to eat food when hungry. So that helps.
Unless you're addicted to food.
Yeah, that's true.
All right.
So it helps a person understand why an alcoholic will lie and cheat and steal and do whatever they have to do to get their substance, because it has now taken control of them. So they cannot, as long as they use their substance, they can never predictably control the outcome. Some days they might, some years they might, but not every time. And so for an addict alcoholic, it's tolerance, physical dependence, cravings, and then there's one
withdrawals.
More. That's part of the physical dependence, and then there's one more, loss of control. Right.
Yeah.
They no longer can control how much they drink.
That's interesting. And so when families don't understand that, they have all this emotional stuff that's going on.
Right.
And you were saying that the families have physical symptoms too.
Right.
You know, which is very interesting, and people don't really understand that.
Right. What happens to the family members, they get caught in the fight or flight response, stress response. And that is another
I hate
instinctual...
you, I'm out of here, or I love you.
Oh no, or what? And that's another instinctual, again, hardwired. This is what's so incredible, is that this all impacts in the limbic system in some of these just... We don't think about it. We don't think about why we eat. We just do, you know. So the fight or flight stress response system triggers, well, let's see, it causes a number of reactions. Blood vessels under the skin to constrict to prevent blood loss should you get cut. It causes the eyes to dilate so you can see better. It causes endorphins to kick in so it blunts pain. It causes the liver to break down glucose so that it adds more energy to where it needs to be. So back in the day, when mankind was evolving, that gave you enough energy to run and get away from the dinosaur, exactly, or the great woolly mammoth. And nowadays, the human species is the only one that can anticipate stress. So we can be in chronic stress and having all those physiological things happening, but then we don't do the running, so they sit. And that's where family members will have
the extra glucose, the extra dopamine,
the endorphins, the blood loss from the skin. So a lot of times family members will present with migraines or depression or anxiety or many physical ailments because the system is constantly being activated, but with no expenditure of the...
Wow.
Yeah, so...